Good afternoon, everyone. Let's start. My name is Barbara Valotskova. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I'll be serving as a moderator for today's Counterpoint Southeast Asia panel discussion. For those of you joining us for the first time, Counterpoint Southeast Asia is a seminar and policy brief series that addresses questions of strategic significance to Southeast Asia by putting together diverse perspectives from invited experts from the region. Each issue of Counterpoint tackles a crucial topic, and today specifically we are addressing the question of is water diplomacy working in the Mekong, and what does this mean for Asia? As you know, the Mekong River, supporting over 70 million people across 6 countries, is a critical resource for Southeast Asia. In recent years, the region has faced mounting pressures from dam building, climate change, and intensifying US-China rivalry, making water diplomacy more important than ever. Therefore, several questions arise. How are Mekong countries and external partners navigating these complex waters? What lessons does their experience offer for transboundary river diplomacy, and how can regional institutions as ASEAN and local communities play a greater role in safeguarding the river's future? And to help us address these questions today, we have invited 3 speakers. Before I introduce them, I would like to remind each of them that they have 10 to 12 minutes to present their key arguments. After each speaker is done with the presentation, we will open the floor to questions and discussion. So, with these points in mind, I'll proceed to briefly introduce the speakers in the order in which they will present. And these are brief introductions for their full impressive profiles. You can refer to their biographies at the CHG website. To begin with, we have Dr. Anulak Kittikun, who is a visiting senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and former chief executive officer of the Mekong River Commission. Our second speaker is Ms. Hoang Thi Ha, who is a senior fellow and co-coordinator of the Regional Strategic and Political Studies program at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sang Hong Tzu, who is an assistant professor at RSIS NTU, researching about regional and global resource conflicts and governance, the role of big tech in international politics, and the governance of emerging technologies. So we have a great lineup with us today, and let's start with Anulak, who will elaborate on how water diplomacy does work in the Mekong despite significant challenges, and share the most important lessons other regions should learn from the Mekong experience. Anulak, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Thanks for putting this panel together, and also thanks to my colleagues Ha and Hongzhou for joining me in this important discussion. So, and also, for all of you for coming to a late afternoon session. So the talk I'm giving is what should and should not be learned from water diplomacy in the Mekong. But before that, we're talking about the Mekong River, as Barbara said, 6 countries in a crucial region of the world, 70 million people. So the good management and mismanagement of the Mekong River affects a lot of people. And because it is such a big and large river, and not only important for the economies, culture, and connectivity of the Mekong countries themselves, but also increasingly important for the rest of ASEAN, including Singapore. Just one statistics, if you're in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, the #1 importer of rice is from the Mekong. For Singapore, it's the #2. The #1 is from India, so you eat more Indian rice than Mekong rice. But the two are very close in terms of statistics. And that's simply because Vietnam and Thailand are the top 2 rice exporters in the world, right? So, and then of course you have energy issue, etc. that probably Professor Hongshu will talk about. So there's lots of challenges in the Mekong having to do with, I think, three sort of sets of challenges. One is how to balance development and protection, right? Economic growth versus environmental protection. Second is how to address this changing climate, right? And third, because it's such a key geostrategic region, how to manage geopolitics, right? And to get behind these challenges, maybe for those of you who don't know the Mekong too deeply, I start with a picture, right? So the Mekong, 6 countries, we start with China, right? Which is an upstream country. China's interest is to use Upper Mekong, what they call the Lansang River, for hydropower production mainly, right? And then you go down to Laos, which is in the middle part, but also downstream of China, but upstream of Cambodia and Vietnam. And Laos has a lot of also potential and actual hydropower development, right? And then on the west, you have Thailand, right? You have Thailand with a big Mekong basin, but very dry. So their interest, besides buying hydropower from Laos, also try to irrigate the northeast, right? So they've been talking about water diversion for years, right? And also, if you go down further, you get Cambodia, which is sort of in between Laos and Vietnam, and has this big river called the Tonle Sap, right? Which is the biggest lake in Southeast Asia, has the biggest fisheries in the world, right? In the world. And that's where their interest. But Cambodia is also developing. So they also try to develop hydropower, they try to build a canal, and all of these things. And then last but not least, you have Vietnam, which is the rice bowl of Southeast Asia, right? Which also developed early than everyone else for its costs and benefits. And then, therefore, you have this contestation with international rivers. But despite these challenges, my pitch is, because I used to work for the Mekong River Commission, so that's where my heart is, I would venture to say that water diplomacy has worked in the Mekong, despite these challenges. And I think a key institution is the system we call the Mekong River Commission. Not just the institution itself, but the system we built around it. And when I was CEO and when I was in the Mekong, there are various international rivers who come to the Mekong and said, how do you guys do it? You know, despite your differences, despite contestations, you seem to manage to get together and keep the peace and keep talking and keep working out and have projects that, you know, are world-class and international standards for many, not all, right? And I said, you know, I began to think about this, especially here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. What are the lessons we've been telling other regions of the world? And I can say 4 of them, right? The first is the MRC and its partner built what we call a soft rules regime. So, meaning we have a treaty. It's called a treaty, the Mekong Agreement, but it's not a hard law. You know, it's a treaty to cooperate, right? It means that it specifies some obligations in terms of data sharing, in terms of consultations on projects, in terms of independent review of projects, in terms of facilitating dialogue, right? Bringing countries together, right? And then to elaborate the treaty, we have several procedures, right? Procedures in terms of maintaining the flow of the river, right? Because maintaining the flow is very important for fish, for environment, for irrigation, downstream, et cetera, right? So we have procedures for all of these things. And then to elaborate further the procedures, we have guidelines, right? How to build a good dam, right? How to get fish upstream, right? How to build safe navigation, how to dredge properly, right? So we have several guidelines. And all of these soft rules regime are developed, negotiated, discussed, debate, until they reach agreement. So they have certain legitimacy, right? But they're not hard laws, right? So, and the reason why they're not hard laws is because first, hard laws are very hard to get, right? Very hard to negotiate. We have lots of experiences in the Mekong when we try to do that, right? There was one guideline that took 18 years to develop, but never agreed until we made a soft law, and then they agreed. So this sort of soft framework provides states with clear obligations in terms of water use, but it does not penalize them if they said, sort of venture off a little bit, right? But what makes it work is the second point, and the third point, and the fourth point. So now the second point. Soft rules, you have a framework. The second point is you need to, in the Mekong, I think, develop some sort of cooperative spirit, right? You sort of have to nurture, have to keep at it, and we, in the Mekong, we call the Mekong spirit, right? Which is that when the going gets tough, you don't walk away from each other. You try to work it out. You try to understand each other. You try to understand each other's interests. You try to understand what are the needs, right? And you may debate very hard at first, but then you have always tried to come back. Of course, there's times in the Mekong history, including maybe recently between two Mekong states, that do not seem to follow this spirit, but it's still there. Right? It's still there, and it will come back. Right? It's not totally gone. So a cooperative framework, a spirit of cooperation that will always make states try to work it out. The third, and these two are not enough, I think. The third is you need to build a sufficiently strong technical and diplomatic institution that is sufficiently objective, impartial, but not totally independent from states. And we call this the secretariat, right? So in all international organizations, they have secretariats. Some are very weak, some are very strong, right? Very strong secretariat is, for example, the European Commission. A very weak secretariat, I'm sorry to say, but maybe it's also in this region, right? But I think the Mekong Secretariat or the MRC Secretariat is in between these two. Right? It's sufficiently strong in terms of its technical knowledge base, which means it has built up for many years, right? It has data, it has assessment, it has knowledge to be able to advise states what the objective things are, right? And that's assist in discussions. Because when different interests of states come together, they tend to think, they have feelings, right? They have misperceptions. So you need a common knowledge base provided by the Secretariat through its technical work, right? But to complement the technical work, and I think this is where diplomacy comes, is you need some skilled leaders in the Secretariat, right? Either the CEO or the number 2 or the number 3, right? That tries to bring these states together, right? That always champion the soft regimes that we have, reminds them politely that you have a cooperative spirit and try to keep them in the room together, right? But sometimes that's not enough. And this is my final ingredient for successful diplomacy, especially water diplomacy, is that you need to leverage your network of partners, right? In the Mekong, being a very contested region, you naturally have superpowers, you have external actors, right, trying to influence. And in the MRC early days, we were dominated by a set of partners, what we call donors at that time, right? Donors come, oh, we want to stop this dam. I actually have one ambassador 15 years ago told me, how do we stop this dam from happening? I said, who are you to tell the countries to stop or not this dam, right? But as the countries became less poor, as the Mekong Secretariat became stronger, as the countries put more resources to the institutions, then I think donors step back. But we tell them, you cannot be gone because we need you. We still need you. We need you because this is a very contested area, and we cannot do it alone. So when you sort of say that, okay, we have a good regimes in place, we have a cooperative spirit, we have a sufficiently strong secretariat, and then I think development partners tend to follow your priorities and way of doing things. And when you ask them, can you put money here, can you put money there, they tend to follow, right? And when you need them to help you lobby the countries quietly, not loudly, they do, right? So this is, I think, you try to manage your networks of development partners, use them strategically, and I think they're very happy to do it. So that's, I think, some reflections in terms of what works in the Mekong. It's not totally perfect, but I think it has kept at least tensions. It has facilitated good projects. It has managed to keep the countries together, and it will eventually bring countries back together. And you can ask me about specific projects that are in the news, right? Now, what should not be learned? The first that should not be learned is reactive planning. So in the MRC, we tend to react to countries' projects, right? When Laos proposed a dam, when Cambodia proposed a canal, when Thailand proposed a diversion, and in the past when Vietnam also proposed a dam, right? We tend to react to it. And it's too late. We cannot stop it. So the best way we can do is try to mitigate, right? Put in the best environmental measures, put in the best design, give people the truth about the impacts, right? And be prepared for it. So that's reactive planning. Now, in the Mekong, we have not always been reactive. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the US at that time, actually an American was the CEO of their predecessor of the MRC, they made up grand plans. They call it proactive planning. And the projects at that time were not Vietnamese projects, Lao projects, Thai projects. They were Mekong projects. And they were optimized from a basin-wide point of view, but for a different era, right? And they say, okay, this is where the best to put dams. This is where you put a canal. This is where you put irrigation, right? And this is where you save for environment. Right? So that's a kind of thing that we haven't done enough in the Mekong. And we need to bring it back. And I think other regions should do the same. And the last thing that should not be learned from the Mekong is sometimes we have a very, I call it biased media and NGO. Okay? So there was a debate 10 years ago about a small dam. And there was one newspaper that says this small dam will displace 20 million people. I mean, it's ridiculous. And when that kind of story came out, it poisons cooperation, right? And then there was also, during the drought of 2019, there was an NGO, so several of them, that says China is the culprit, right? And then that also poisons the chance for cooperation because China came out very strongly and said, no, it was not us, right? And then recently there was also some examples. So these are the things that should and should not be learned from my perspective in the Mekong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anurag, for outlining the foundations that have enabled Mekong cooperation to work. You have showed that how flexible governance frameworks and strong secretariats can manage tensions even without enforcement power. Building on this foundation, I would like to turn to Ha, who offers a different lens on these dynamics and will explain how the Mekong differs from the South China Sea in the context of the US-China rivalry. Ha, please share your thoughts.
Thank you, Barbara, and my thanks also go to the whole team of your preparing for this workshop and the Center on Asia and Globalization for having me back to the Counterpoint Southeast Asia brief series. For my presentation, before I go to the geopolitics of US-China competition and how it has impacted the dynamics in the Mekong Basin, I also would like to try to address the key question that is featured in the title of this workshop, is water diplomacy working in the Mekong? And I think the answer depends on two qualifiers: working for whom and by what benchmarks. So Anurag has provided an inside-out perspective as the former CEO of the MRC Secretariat, a very pragmatic and also understanding. For me, I think my presentation would be more on the outside in, and unfortunately, I have consumed a lot of international media and also NGOs' perspectives as well. So for the first part, water diplomacy, is it working for whom? There are three levels, I think. At the national level, downstream states, as we all know, are inherently disadvantaged compared to upstream countries, and that is the tyranny of geography. But I would also highlight that the degree and implications vary across specific cases. For China and to some extent Laos, as the most upstream countries, engagement in water diplomacy is quite selective and pursued when convenient. And water sovereignty, which is the right to use and to control and to utilize the water resources within its border, has always been the overriding principle. Further downstream, Cambodia has been very much adversely impacted by by development upstream, including dam building. But when it comes to its own flagship project, the Funan Techo Canal, water sovereignty is also invoked by Phnom Penh as the guiding principle for the development. Downstream Thailand and most downstream Vietnam, while very much concerned and affected by the upstream dam building, have their own companies and banks involved in hydropower development and buy power from Lao hydropower dams. So there is a complexity of interest there, and it is not a very clear cut of downstream, upstream, although as a general rule of thumb, downstream countries are naturally disadvantaged. I also would like to highlight the subnational actors, which is very important. And there are distinct sets of subnational or local winners and losers. The winners, I guess, would include hydropower operators, energy industry players, and local and central governments who prioritize macroeconomic benefits such as power generation, energy security, and GDP growth, of course. And losers are mostly smallholder fishermen and riparian communities whose livelihoods are tied directly to the river's ecosystem. And at the third level, which is also, I think, a very critical layer, which is the Mekong River itself, its hydrology, its seasonal rhythm, and of course, the biodiversity that depends on them. So I think any assessment of the effectiveness of the water diplomacy in the Mekong must account for whether the river as an ecological system is being safeguarded or not. And on the second element, by what benchmarks? If the benchmark is the avoidance of resource-induced conflict or breakdown of bilateral relations, then I think water diplomacy in the Mekong can be said to be working so far, because disagreements over the use of the water resources, transboundary water resources, have still been managed peacefully and in certain cases consultatively through bilateral and sub-regional mechanisms, especially the MRC. But if the benchmark is a rules-based, equitable, and sustainable transboundary water governance regime, one that balances effectively the right to develop water resources with the obligation not to harm neighbors, and ensures fair and equitable use, then the record has been much more sobering. I think the costs and benefits of water development and management in the Mekong have been very unevenly distributed, both across countries and within countries. And the tension between water sovereignty and regional cooperation remains very stark, with the former water sovereignty often prevailing over the latter. In the second part of my presentation, I will go further to the higher politics of the US-China competition, which has added yet another layer of complexity to the cooperation and contestation in the Mekong Basin. 3 years ago, the Counterpoint brief series has a series called Will the Mekong River Become the Next South China Sea? And I think the answer is quite clear-cut. It's very different, and it will not, I think. Although they are often presented as the two waterfronts in Southeast Asia, where great power rivalry increasingly plays out. The dynamics in the Mekong Basin are very different, because I think in the South China Sea, Washington and Beijing engage with a degree of strategic symmetry, and where hard security, military power, power projection are at the core. But in the Mekong, the balance of power tilts decisively towards China. And also, at the core of the Mekong contestations are developmental, environmental, and governance, and it is not hard security. Back to the point of China's asymmetric influence in the region vis-a-vis Washington. Of course, China controls the river's headwaters, and of course the flows downstream upon which millions or dozens of millions of people depend for their livelihoods for many, many centuries. China has also become the dominant economic partner of all Mekong countries, the leading infrastructure financier, and I think critically important, China is actually the political ally of all the lower Mekong ruling regimes. And China has leveraged these structural advantages to shape the regional dynamics to fit its interests, but also its development philosophy. Its Mekong strategy, from my point of view, adopts a top-down, state-centric approach which prioritizes elite political ties and macroeconomic incentives. And through leader exchanges, big-ticket infrastructure development, and extensive trade and investment, Beijing has exercised its influence primarily through the national and local governments as well as the business sectors. And this top-down approach, in effect, has sidelined the local communities and civil society organizations, who are, of course, traditionally most vocal about the environmental impacts of the dams. And the China-led Lanchang Mekong Corporation, the LMC, which was established in 2015, exemplifies this top-down development-centric approach. And through the LMC, China has tried to promote upstream dams as providing regional public goods, i.e. moderating the flows for flood control during the flood season and to relieve drought during the dry seasons, and also provide power to enhance regional energy security. And also through the MLC, China has embedded water management issues within a broader agenda of economic development and cooperation, and therefore it has effectively recast the regional discourse, shifting the attention further away from the sensitive water security issues and to the more broad, comprehensive win-win economic partnerships. So I think for China, the river, especially the downstream part, is primarily a means to power economic development and not an end in itself. As for the US, why the strategic competition with China has intensified its attention and engagement with the region, particularly during the first Trump administration. The concerns for the river and the human environmental dimensions surrounding the river have remained a central driver of its engagement. And in contrast to China's top-down, state-centric approach, the US has sought to strengthen the knowledge and amplify the voices of local communities, civil society, the scientific and expert community on the impact of the dams. And of course, it has zeroed in on China, criticizing China dam building as cases that show cases of irresponsible behavior of the so-called upstream hegemon. And why China focuses on the hardware, connectivity through highways, bridges, railways, oil and gas pipelines, power grid. The US builds institutions. China builds infrastructure. The US builds institutions. The US try to focus on the software, which involves, initiatives about good governance, transparency, and environmental safeguards. But of course, as the offshore balancer, the US engagement in the Mekong often faces this persistent challenge of sustaining attention and investment amidst its ever-shifting international priorities and especially domestic politics. And we have seen this challenge has become particularly acute during the current Trump administration. It has withdrawn the US from the global development agenda so dramatically and abruptly, and also it has increased tariff hikes against mainland Southeast Asia, especially Myanmar and Laos. And the US aid, which has been traditionally the main channel for its engagement in the sub-region, has now diminished significantly with the abrupt closure of US aid. And the US aid has been, I think, a very key partner in the implementation of various initiatives and activities under the Mekong US framework, the MUSP, the Mekong US partnership. But beyond the US-China dynamics, other major powers are also very active in the Mekong. And this has added the balance, the complexity, and also the diversity to the cooperation landscape. These include, for example, Japan, which has been a long-standing economic partner in the region, India, Australia, South Korea, and some European nations. So the lower Mekong states, I think, have embraced the approach of the more the merrier when it comes to the cooperation, international cooperation. They try to enmesh China for economic gains and press for more responsible water management, but at the same time actively engaging other powers to enhance environmental oversight, additional or alternative development partners, and diversification of economic relations, also to build institutional capacity, environmental safeguards, and good governance. So, as I mentioned earlier, the South China Sea is very different from the Mekong. And ultimately, the choice for lower Mekong states is not, in this region, sub-region, is not the one between the US and China, but more about their own development path. I think it boils down conceptually to how we define modernity and what modernization means for societies whose livelihoods have been inseparable from the river's natural systems for centuries. And I think true water diplomacy must navigate effectively this tension between modernization and ecological sustainability.
Thank you, Ha, for that very nuanced analysis of power dynamics. You have shown how China's structural advantages in the Mekong create fundamentally different competitive dynamics compared to the militarized South China Sea, while also emphasizing that regional states retain agency in choosing their development paths. And this brings us to our final perspective from Hong Chu, who will examine China's water diplomacy strategy, its effectiveness in achieving strategic objectives, and the broader implications of China's approach for regional energy security and also climate governance across Asia. Hong Chu, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you again for the invite. It's so great to be back to my alma mater. To reconnect, give me the opportunity to reconnect with my former professors, my supervisor, Prof. here. So later on, if you have tough questions, right, I know who I can turn to for help. The water diplomacy is a very special topic for me, especially here, because the first time I was asked to deliver a speech or lecture was 8 years ago on water diplomacy, right? I remember the topic I was talking about 7 years ago was the role of subnational government, as highlighted, Yunnan's government in a shift in driving the change in China's Mekong water policy. It's also part of my PhD thesis, and the fact that right now, after a few years, we are still talking about water diplomacy, which is of course quite relevant to my PhD thesis, so it implies I learned quite well during my times here in LKYSPP school, because my professor always tell me that you need to choose a topic that is policy relevant and that will be important, let's say, in the future. Well, with that, I'm very happy to share my views in terms of my assessment on the effectiveness of China's water diplomacy. I think my previous speakers have already explained the background, right, Mekong and, of course, China's role. So I won't spend too much time on it. I just want to, let's say, give you a little bit background in terms of the changes in China's approaches to water diplomacy. Right, since the 1980s, right, China has started unilaterally building dams on upstream of Mekong, right, in the Chinese Lantang rivers, which of course triggered a lot of tension, concerns, and criticism from international communities, but more importantly from downstream countries. China has been blamed, criticized, and for these unilateral dam building activities, and also the fact that China has long refused to join the MRC, although it remains as dialogue partners, right, has adopted a bilateral approach to deal with water conflicts, water tensions for many years. That was until 2015, right? There was a major shift in China's water approaches towards Mekong water conflicts when China introduced the Lancang Mekong Initiative, the LMC. So that marked, right, a paradigm shift, and it has almost been 10 years since that initiative was launched. So the question, of course, arises, and is part of this panel, is how effective it was. It has been, as Ha has mentioned, right, when we want to talk about effectiveness of this approach, we need, first of all, effective to whom, and by what metrics. So in the context of China, right, we'll be talking about how effective in advancing China's interest. So in that particular case, we need to define what diplomacy is and what China wants to achieve by adopting water diplomacy. In general, there are two approaches to define water diplomacy. One is the narrow approach, where basically use water as all sorts of means to manage water tensions, improve water management, reduce conflicts. This is quite a narrow approach, it's water-centric. Another is a broader approach. It's basically elevate water issues to diplomatic and foreign policy domains with the objective that is much bigger and broader than, let's say, water conflicts prevention or water cooperation. Instead, it includes a lot of other objectives like cross-border economic development, investment, people-to-people exchange, and regional integration, including geopolitical influence. In that particular regard, right, China has adopted a much broader definition or conceptualization of water diplomacy, and it intends to achieve two primary objectives. The first and foremost is about conflict prevention. It's about preventing, as Ha has alluded to, right, South Mekong water issues, the Mekong became the second South China Sea. That was a very important objective for China. And the second is about strategic regional engagement. It's about using water corporations as means to create favorable conditions for implementation of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which includes promoting regional economic integration, broader, faster or closer trade relations, enhancing security and stability, expanding China's geopolitical influence. So with these two overriding objectives, China's water diplomacy, as we can easily conclude, has been, as my previous panel has concluded, is very successful, is successful for China. Because first and foremost, as we know, there's at least some general consensus, the Mekong water issue is far from being close to the level of tensions or diplomatic debate or dispute as that of South China Sea. And the second, this again is related to the first aspect, and it's also mentioned by her, the narrative, how South China Mekong water issue is being framed. So for many years, the Mekong water hydropolitics was framed in terms of upstream, downstream, in focusing on China unilateral dam building. But China has tried to change, adopt a different narrative, a different, let's say, frame, that is community of shared destiny, or community of common destiny, which has been proposed, introduced by Chinese president, and then later on advanced on different domains. And in the context of Mekong, is community of shared destiny in Mekong that China has spent enormous diplomatic effort in trying to push forward that narrative. And if you look through, check the policy document, over the years, and you have so many joint political communiques, statement between China and other Mekong River countries, as well as and multilateral settings with reference or with endorsement to this particular concept. And third, again, China has shifted regional water management or governance discourse from a donor-driven environmental concerned or environmental-centered approach to a more development-centered model with China at its center, Water cooperation has been promoted, has been identified as one of the so-called key areas, the priority areas under LMC, but it was not the only area. There are so many other areas, including agriculture, poverty reduction, production capacities, cross-border trade, investment, people-to-people exchange. And if you look at the scope of corporations under LMC, increasingly it has been increasingly expanding, and in recent years, it already include areas like innovation corridor, AI, and of course EVs as well. And if you look at, let's say, in terms of economic progress, we have heard about, China has already become the largest, let's say, trading partners, investors, all Mekong River countries, and then in terms of overall trade volumes between China and other Mekong River countries has increased by over 100% since the launch of LMC. And finally, another aspect, again, is related to analog point about institutional building. Of course, it has not reached, we need, of course, systematic studies to conclude on that, but in comparison, as you look at, let's say, various mechanisms or some mechanisms that has been implemented, introduced under MC, it has been remarkable as well. You have so-called leaders summit, foreign ministers meeting, 10 times already, and then joint work, various ministers meeting as well, and then joint working groups on different topics, as well as growing involvement of subnational actors, provincial actors, city actors, universities, media, so on and so forth, under MC. It has been regular meetings on different topics. So in terms of institutional building, there has been remarkable achievement as well under MC. So, if we can conclude, China's water diplomacy has been largely effective. what kind of implications it has on Southeast Asian, on other Mekong River countries. Of course, we can talk about so many other different areas, but the topic that was given to me is about energy and climate change. So I will just briefly touch on that. Of course, it's a very important topic for a number of reasons, for let's say at least two reasons. First, hydropower development is a major focus of China's, let's say, our engagement with Lancang River countries, with lower Lancang, Mekong River countries. China has been a major financer, as well as, of course, a major builder of hydro dams across other countries, and has been has also been trying to invest a huge amount of money in terms of other energy-related infrastructures, power grids, so on and so forth. And another point that is important is because in the lower Lancang Mekong region, right, as growing and all countries by varying degrees face energy shortages. And in the face of, let's say, growing climate change pressures, countries has to decarbonize, right? When you face, let's say, energy shortages but has to decarbonize, you will have to find alternative source of energies, right? But on the other hand, among all the, let's say, alternative renewable source of energies, right, solar, wind, and hydropower. Hydropower, in the case of Mekong, of course, there's huge potentials begin with, and of course, much more stable. So which also means, right, there's great potentials for further development, which would contribute to the region's climate commitment. So in this context, I would say, right, increased investment by China in clean energies, particularly hydropower projects, is seen critical to meeting energy demand while contributing to climate mitigation goals. And then this also explains, right, you have changing of tones and attitude, especially among regional countries, regional government towards hydropower development, as Ha has alluded to as well. Especially in the cases, right, Vietnam used to be the most vocal critiques of hydropower development by upstream countries, but there has been, right, notable change of tones and approaches. In fact, right, Vietnamese state-owned enterprises have been investing in some of the major dams in upstream nodes as well. And then this is, again, quite important in the current context, right, as given a recent rapid development in terms of EV sectors, right, the huge demand to new clean energies, and also, of course, AI, right? Southeast Asian countries from Vietnam to Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, of course, all right, trying very hard to build data centers and develop their local semiconductor industries, for all of which needs huge amount of energies. And in this particular context, right, which also means the gap will be wider. You need, let's say, new resource, new investment, and new supplies. In that particular perspective, hydropower development is seen as one of the critical solutions to this. Nevertheless, I think let me just end by saying, right, social and environmental aspect, environmental cost should not be overlooked, right? If you look at China's own experience and the dam, right, tragedies in Laos, right, if mismanaged, right, you have catastrophic impacts on local communities, and of course, not to mention the environmental impact as well. So let me just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hong Chu, for that comprehensive assessment showing how the Lancang-Mekong cooperation shifted regional discourse while positioning hydropower as central to addressing energy and climate challenges. So we have heard three very insightful presentations on whether diplomacy is working in the Mekong and what this means for Asia. And before we move on to the Q&A session, I'd like to ask each speaker a question. So I'll start with Anurag. Anurag, your essay focuses primarily on the MRC's role. In your view, should ASEAN play a more active role in Mekong water diplomacy, or would this complicate the existing frameworks you advocate? My question to her is, given, as you mentioned, the Trump administration's withdrawal from the global development initiatives and the curtailment of USAID operations, how significant are these policy reversals for American influence in the region, and what alternative mechanisms might the United States employ or not to maintain meaningful engagement without traditional development aid channels? And my question to Hong Chu is, given your assessment that Chinese water diplomacy has been effective, what challenges do you anticipate as we know, energy demands will increase and climate impacts will intensify? Will the current model prove resilient in your view and under all these pressures? So these are my questions. I have many more, but yeah, I think let's just stick to these three. Yes, so Anlak, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Well, Mekong is the largest river or basin in Southeast Asia. And as I alluded, I think in my talk, it's not only important for the Mekong countries, but also increasingly for the rest of ASEAN countries. And I talk already about food. I talk about some increasingly, potentially energy. But also tourism, right? There's a lot of non-Mekong countries, tourism into mainland Southeast Asia, and 30-40% of that is in the Mekong. So there is interest, I think, for the rest of ASEAN to make sure that what's happening in the Mekong is sustainable, it's protected, and it's productive, right? Productive in terms of energy, productive in terms of food, productive in terms of be a catalyst for further integration, connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. So traditionally, when we were in the Cold War, you have this divide, right, between, except maybe for Thailand, between the mainland and the coastal states in ASEAN. And then when the end of the Cold War, when the rest of the Mekong states joined ASEAN, starting with Vietnam and then Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, then there was a bit of a push from ASEAN to somehow incorporate Mekong agenda into its institutions. It set up some programs, but it didn't gain traction because I think some of the Mekong states were sort of saying, well, we don't really want you to come into our business. We already have the MRC, we have several other institutional frameworks, and this is quite enough. But I think recently, because also Mekong states have reached out to the rest of ASEAN, primarily Vietnam, but also others, and the MRC itself have reached out to the rest of ASEAN. Now the two institutions are increasingly recognizing each other's in terms of how we can support each other. Indonesia had recently become a partner of the MRC. Singapore will probably follow soon. And then, you could have Malaysia and others. And institutionally, there's an upgrade already between secretariat to secretariat relationship, now to whole of organization relationship with MOU in 2018. And now we hold every 2 years, ASEAN MRC Water Security Dialogue, first at the technical level and then recently at the ministerial level. Maybe at the next time there will be a summit. And now there's an active push in the MRC to hold between the summits of the MRC, an interim MRC summit on the sideline of ASEAN summits. So I think it's on the right track, but there's always more that can be done. And the approach that we are advocating is that in order to not be seen as interfering, is you have to support whatever the institutions that are in place in the Mekong, right? So you strengthen the MRC, you strengthen the other Mekong framework, including LMC. Because in the MRC, we made a lot of efforts to cooperate with LMC. There was a bit of uncertainty in 2016-17, but I had to drink a lot of Mau Tai, to lessen that uncertainty. Now we work well together. and there's a lot of back and forth and good cooperation. There's always can be more, but we always approach and we always advocate that look north, look south, and beyond in the MRC. North meaning China, south meaning ASEAN, and beyond the rest of the world.
Thank you, Anurag. Ha, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Barbara. On the Trump administration's withdrawal from the global development agenda and the closure of the US aid operations and the implications for the sub-region, I think they have really created grave consequences immediately, actually, and dramatically for those stakeholders who had been the key beneficiaries of the US development assistance in the region. For many decades, the US aid, and I emphasize the point aid, not loans. China's development financing in the region has been primarily loans and not aid, not grants, because it has a very different approach to aid. But the US aid to the region has been mainly channeled through grants and focusing on soft infrastructure, as I have mentioned, humanitarian assistance, human capital, good governance, grassroots empowerment. So according to the Lowy Institute database, between 2015 and 2022, the US humanitarian aid alone to the region, and most of it was directed to mainland Southeast Asia because it was much less developed than maritime Southeast Asia. The total amount was 1.5 billion versus only 38 million by China in terms of humanitarian assistance. And in the past, the 4 pillars, the DEI, the diversity, equality, inclusivity, and sustainability have been the key normative pillars for the US development assistance for the region. And now the Trump administration has been so hostile to all these 4 pillars. And I think apart from the impacts on the stakeholders in the sub-region, especially the NGOs, for example, those who work on the grassroots empowerment and also environmental advocacy, a big casualty has been the US soft power and influence in the region because development assistance has long been a cornerstone of the US soft power and moral authority in the region. And the withdrawal of aid has really undercut decades of trust built and credibility, and as well as the credibility of the US among various stakeholders in the region, the future leaders, the people, and also the civil society. What alternative mechanisms might the US employ to maintain meaningful engagement without the aid mechanism? I think given the Trump's record of cutting national public goods even at home and the MAGA hostility towards sustainability, DEI, everything, I don't think we can expect the US return to the traditional development assistance anytime soon. And a more realistic alternative is to mobilize capital from the American private sector or philanthropic foundations. They, of course, are no substitute to the US aid, but I think they can still have us have the US maintain its presence and support in human capital development and technology and also civil society engagement. And I think a good channel can be done through those partners of the US in the Mekong, like-minded partners in the mechanism called Friends of the Mekong. Actually, the U.S. is very much aware of its limitations in terms of financing or resources for the lower Mekong countries, and therefore it has engaged other like-minded partners like Australia, Japan, ROK, through the mechanism Friends of Mekong, and many development assistance and technical assistance projects by the U.S. to the region have been undertaken through these partnerships, like U.S., Australia, for example, the Mekong Safeguards or something, with Australia. So I think mainland Southeast Asian countries should try to maintain these channels, these like-minded partners. And in terms of meaningful engagement by the US in the region, a lot still hinges on how the second Trump administration will define meaningful engagement and whether the president would give it any slightest care, because Trump's worldview is ruthlessly transactional, and he only cares about the monetary and commercial interests for the US businesses and people and citizens. And he favors hard bargaining and bilateralism, as we can see from the tariff negotiations. So at least in the next 3.5 years, I think we can expect that mainland Southeast Asian countries will have to engage with the Trump administration one-to-one, bilaterally, with a lot of disadvantage on their side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ha. Hong Chu, let's hear from you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful question. Let me just first address the first point about the impacts of climate change and energy demand on China's water diplomacy. I think as I have basically covered a little bit during my sharings, is a good news for China for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, right, the reason why there has been much more, let's say, take up buying of China's various initiatives on the LMC is because the region recognized that, right, you need more energies and need more clean energies. This is particularly true, right, when you had a Paris Accord, and then all countries basically had to commit for decarbonize, and then while you had rising demand for energy, so you had to basically make up the gap from somewhere, right? Basically means you need to put more investment in, let's say, clean energies, right? First is hydropower. China is a major donor, a major investor, of course, builder. There's no other alternatives, basically. Also, for, let's say, for other clean energies, right, from solar, wind, China is by far has the capacity and technology, right? If you want to develop these sectors, right, you had to look for, right? China's, of course, is there. Another is you need, right? When you have climate, right, growing climate, let's say, extreme events, there will be vulnerabilities, right? You need to adapt, mitigate all these negative impacts, and then what is happening right now on the LMC is China is willing to provide a lot of money on it, right? Under the LMC, China has basically committed, right, hundreds of millions of dollars, not, let's say, not just on the big projects, but increasingly on the smaller projects as well, right? If you look at what has happening right now, at least special official document, they say they have invested over 1,000, nearly 1,000 so-called small and beautiful projects on various, right, domains, from irrigation, water saving, right, sanitation, agriculture, so on and so forth. So for China, if I give this rising demand and climate threats, perhaps we will push more, let's say, the Southeast Asian countries or other Mekong River countries closer to China, and then which also means much more buying of China's water diplomacy. But there is risk, right? Whether in face of this climate risk, energy risk, the mechanism of water diplomacy will remain resilient. It depends, pretty much depends on what is, let's say, the scale of the risk, right? If, let's say, for smaller risk, right, all existing mechanism, you expect, especially in terms of major dam, right? If you have, let's say, smaller floods, smaller droughts, right? If it's coordinations and plannings, this can be mitigated. But I think the risk is, right, if you have, let's say, mega drought or long-lasting flood, that in that particular case, I think, let's say, a drought lasts for months, and then every country's, let's say, dams operators will have to fight for the little water resources available. Then you have tensions. That will be where, right, you will see whether how resilient this mechanism is. But based on the past experiences, I think at least as also your research, right, has on Southeast Asian or ASEAN, basically touch on, right? This kind of mechanism, institution that respond to crisis quite often, right? You see new mechanisms being introduced when you have major crisis. One of the example in this particular area is, let's say, right, in 2020, correct me if I'm wrong, right? When there's a major drought and then criticisms about the dams, and China began to share full-year hydro data to the rest of the Mekong River countries, which is an improvement in a sense. Okay, I will stop here.
Thank you so much. So now we would like to invite questions from our audience. We'll take a few questions at a time before having our panelists respond. So when asking your questions, please kindly introduce yourself and speak clearly into the microphone so everyone can hear. Yes, please.
Hi. So I'm Srijan. I'm an MPP Junior, Masters in Public Policy. My question was to Professor Hong. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, Hongzhu. And basically, I think you pointed out in the beginning of your talk that how China has been building increasing number of dams. And so I come from India, and I think how I see it is leverage in a way. And it's also sort of using its comparative advantage to build infrastructure at a scale at a very fast pace. And I think the second advantage being that a lot of rivers do originate in the Tibetan region. So my question was, say in a bilateral scenario, what can be ways of responding to such leverage, and where can diplomacy really help here? Because, for example, in the Mekong case, ASEAN can maybe step in. There's a window of opportunity there, whereas in a bilateral situation, that may not be the case. So what are certain, say, diplomatic alternatives there?
Thank you for your question. Do we have any more questions? Yes, please. Yes.
My first question is for Professor Zhang. Your paper revealed the role of Yunnan province in shaping China's Mekong policy, and also Yunnan is an important, central player in China's energy security. It is an important player in the region, and it provides public good to the translational public good to the neighboring countries, like building cross-border infrastructure and the public health sectors. However, at the moment, the Yunnan province faces too many challenges like local debt and rampant corruption in the provincial government and the SOE, the electricity department, the dam coalition you mentioned in your paper. So my question is, will this local issue influence China's Mekong policy implementation and the role of Yunnan in the China's neighbor diplomacy? And my second question is for Ms. Kuan. Sorry for my mispronounce. You mentioned the subnational level in the water diplomacy in Southeast Asian countries, and I'm quite interested in the Vietnam. We know that Vietnam is ongoing the two-tier local government reforms, and I wonder what kind of autonomous and space of Vietnam local government will gain from Hanoi to get involved with the water diplomacy and government.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions. Yes, Dennis?
Maybe this is to Anwar. I think you mentioned that there's greater engagement now between ASEAN and MRC. And I have GMS, Greater American Sub-region, but that includes China, right? But just within ASEAN.
Thank you, Dennis. Let's take one more question. Anybody? Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Arindam Joshi. I'm a MIA Master in International Affairs Junior. Well, my question is slightly different from the issues that we had discussed today. So it is, how can MRC-led water diplomacy be strengthened to address the challenges posed by transnational drug trafficking along the Mekong, and particularly regarding to the cross-border cooperation and governance integration, and especially because new and improved infrastructural projects are making it somewhat smoother for the drug traffickers to making it, they're using it to their advantage to some extent is what I feel. So, and this question is to Professor Anulak.
Thank you. So, Hongsu, there are two questions for you, so maybe you can start.
Great, thank you so much for the wonderful questions, which is excellent. Let me just first address your point about the approaches and then the bilateral. Yes, as you probably what you have in mind is, of course, what recent development in China is building a mega super dams upstream of Brahmaputra, which again is one of my research areas for many years. So again, maybe just before I touch on that, let me big background on what had motivated, right? Clearly, right, you have AI and EV take a boom, which create new energy demand, right, for China, and then the climate change also, right? China is committed so much on in terms of reducing its carbon emissions, right, achieving carbon neutral, decarbonize the economy. So when you face this, right, when you have to increase your energy demand because when energy supply because of AI and EV sectors are booming. On the other hand, you cannot develop, right, continue to rely on fossil fuels. You have to basically look for other alternatives. Hydropower is, right, huge potentials are only on so-called unexploited areas is somewhere there. That's why there's motivations and then increasing eventually led to the political decisions in terms of starting that particular project. Very controversial to think about, and there's a background. I think some similar logic you're observing, right? If you talk about climate change and let's say energy demand in the context of Mekong. But while I agree with you, right? When you bilateral levels, China is very big, it's upstream, right? It has other advantage. It has huge, let's say, leverages. That's why China has often been labeled or been so-called framed as hydro hegemon, right? Can do whatever you want, right? With little regard to the so-called downstream countries, as in the case of Mekong, let's say, India, Brahmaputra. But there is actually some positive development, especially with regards to BRR and MAC. Let me just give you one example about what really happened, how this so-called China-led, right, BRR has major impacts on transboundary water development. So similar situation was observed between China and Kazakhstan in the Ili and Irtysh River. For many years, China was basically utilizing and diverting waters, right? There's the only water that China has utilized so much and diverted so much from its shared internal river is in Ili and Irtysh, not so much in Mekong and Brahmaputra. So Kazakhstan, as a downstream country, is much smaller, always want China to sign a so-called agreement. But China, right, you don't really have the leverage and not pressure to do so, but it changed. When China wants so bad, right, in terms of the Kazakhstan support for BRR. So Kazakhstan president and leadership basically utilized this as a so-called leverage issue linkage, pressure China to talk and negotiate on water issues. I think a similar thing is happening in the case of lower Mekong River countries. I think recent joint statement between China and Vietnam, right? You do see Vietnam, the leaders, they basically exert, right, important point in terms of equitable use of water resources in terms of water development. And also in the past, right, there has been important points stressed by Vietnam in these various bilateral, multilateral meetings, right? You need better plannings, coordinations among member states in terms of water utilization. So again, it's not right. So this kind of, when China has this introduced land development to MSCs, it had very strong incentives to make it a success, which create some sort of leverage actually for other countries to utilize the platform to push for. But how much you can push, because it depends on a lot of other factors as well. The second question about role of local governments. Well, thank you so much for your interest in my paper, and of course, I think one of the things that, at least when I write that particular paper, what I found, right, especially in the context of China, everyone think about Chinese government, right, China's approach to Mekong or other things is about one person is making decisions in Beijing. But there is important subnational actors, and in that particular case, is Yunnan presidential government. We talk about so much why China has cared so much about hydropower development. But that was actually first proposed by provincial government using hydropower development as so-called provincial economic development pillar. So there was conflict of interest among different departments and different groups, right? What should be the development priority for Yunnan? There was what you can navigations, tourism, power. So eventually, provincial government decided we should let power development, right, electricity be the #1 driver of Yunnan's economic development, and that, right, of course, translated a huge amount of investment and political lobbying as well in terms of hydropower development. And then that is actually reflected very clearly, but one of the major so-called overlooked area is how ideas matters. Because if you look through, right, the entire domestic discussions or thinkings about what should China do with Mekong, right, the publications, academic, right, general publication is dominated by Yunnan scholars, Yunnan officials. Right? If you think about it, logically think, right, if people are in Beijing, right, there are so many things to talk about. They're basically quite time responding. Whenever there's a crisis, they have to consult, right, what is going on here. And then they have to basically, people have been educated in a way, right? The perceptions and what is the solution? How should we frame the problem? What kind of solution should we prescribe to deal with this? And it's strongly influenced, right? Not by the central actors, right? By academics, by advocate, policy entrepreneurs at different levels. I think, again, let me just under one point, right? The similar observations are being made in the context of China's development in the Brahmaputra. You have Tibet government and, of course, relevant scholars, how they have many years tried to advocate for that. But, of course, we cannot precisely attribute to what percentage, right, their contribution is. But there is a role they play.
Please go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you for your question. Although I must admit that I'm not an expert on this topic and how to link it to the water diplomacy, which is more at the national or intergovernmental level. The bureaucratic streamlining in Vietnam that has been undertaken in the past few months has been very dramatic. We call it the institutional revolution. And basically, it has cut down we call the 3-layer system, the central, provincial, the 4-layer system, central, provincial, district, communal, now to central, provincial, and communal. And that means that we do away with the district level to cut down on a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. And as part of that exercise, I think the local autonomy of especially provinces has been strengthened. And with that, also the increased accountability by the provincial authorities in implementing, in licensing, implementing, and executing projects, development projects within their authority. And I think they also have greater discretion over the use of budget, provincial budget. And resources within the province. So I would expect that, the provinces of Vietnam, especially those border provinces with neighboring countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, would have greater dynamism and incentive to engage with their sister provinces in neighboring countries. Sister provinces mechanism has been an existing arrangement for many years between Vietnam and neighboring countries to promote cross-border trade, transport linkages, and also people-to-people connectivity like tourism. So I would expect that, you know, if they are given greater autonomy in areas where they can play a greater role, then I think we have good reasons to expect that you know, the provinces will play a more active role or meaningful role in all of these provincial or local people-to-people exchanges with the neighboring countries.
Thank you, Ha. So, Anurag, there is a question from Dennis and one question on transnational drug trafficking for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dennis. Well, I think you can potentially revive the ASEAN Mekong Development Cooperation Framework, but I think this time do with MRC. And the reason is maybe economic growth and economic integration in ASEAN that is very relevant to the Mekong are 4 sectors that are quite the mandate also of the MRC. One is energy. You know, we talk about ASEAN power grid, for example. So a lot of energy would come from the Mekong. Not only Laos, but Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. Thailand itself, you know, it also wants to play this game. Second is tourism. I think tourism is also a mandate of the MRC, although the MRC doesn't really work on it. But I think if you build up tourism as an economic growth engine, that would be very good. The third is transport, navigation. You know, we talk a lot about rail, we talk about flights, connectivity. But potentially, if you develop energy infrastructure, you can also elevate navigation. And experiences from Europe and everywhere in the world, navigation is very cost effective, it's very safe, and very relevant in terms of multimodal transport and connectivity. And the last is food, right? The last is food. So we have a lot of fish, we have a lot of rice, we have a lot of crops. So this can be very important for food security for the rest of ASEAN. So I think do with the regional institution. But I think we also should cooperate with GMS and LMC. You know, let's not cut out the big guy. This question about drugs. So, well, MRC, I think they have enough on their plate. So no drugs, no scams, and no other things. Maybe one. Sorry.
Hong Jun, would you like to add on that question? Or?
Well, I think it's a key focus for China's MLC, right? Drug trafficking, security, safeties, right? They've been working a lot on that. Joint patrols, border securities.
So we have a few minutes left for final questions. Yes, please. Over there.
Hi, Daniel Moss, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. I have a question about the impact on the southern Vietnamese economy of the sinking of the Mekong Delta. How big a challenge is that for Vietnam?
For the question, we can collect maybe 2 more. We have 6 minutes. Yes, at the back, please.
Good evening. I'm Jetta, a recent MTT fellow of SCI and MPP student at LKYSPP. So there have been mention of several issues related to the Mekong, and like from what I heard from lived experience of people is that recently, you know, climate change is intensifying, and there will be like natural disaster, especially floods, and with all the dams being built, with water going up, they would like release the water quickly, and that would create catastrophe for people in the lower Mekong Basin, and that also relates to tourism. That the Mekong region, instead of being like good for tourists, I have a stepdad who likes to kayak, and with all the dams now, everything is, it's not a landscape that has any characteristic anymore. It's just like water that loses its color with all the sediments being trapped by the dam, and all the places that you could kayak in the past that are now like barred by the dams, and you can't even row on them anymore. And also on like the dams themselves, the reason you would create it often is really to energy of like during clean energy, but then often the construction of dams also sink these organic matters that create more methane, which kind of defeats the purpose of creating them, and it also creates, all of these things create problems for the locals in these like lower Mekong countries. So I'm asking, like, with all these challenges piling up and like also accelerating climate change, and do you think what kind of things like water diplomacy can do to deal with that, and how countries in ASEAN can position to make sure everything is accounted for, and maybe, I don't want to say taken advantage of, but then there's like some fairness and some compensation to help people who are affected by these phenomenon. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Sorry, we have to stop here to have time for answers. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your question. Well, the Mekong Delta is considered our rice bowl and fruit basket. I think the critical importance of the Mekong Delta to Vietnam's economic security and food security is unmatched by any other region in the country. It accounts for 1/3 of Vietnam's GDP, 90% of Vietnam's rice export, 70% of our seafood, and 60% of our seafood production, and 70% of our fruit crops. I think Vietnam is the country that would face almost an existential challenge from the environmental collapse of the Mekong's ecosystem in the long run. And I think a lot of it has to do with not only dam building or upstream, but also intensive economic development activities within the Mekong Delta by the Vietnamese people, irrigation, sand mining, and urbanization, all sorts of things. Although I think that upstream dam building is something that causes a lot of concern because it is something that is beyond our control. And what we can do is only mitigation or adaptation on our part. And some, I would ask maybe Anulak to verify, but I read some research saying that 30% of sediments have been lost because of the upstream dams in the Mekong, and that would involve a lot of food insecurity for the region, especially for Vietnam. And the issue of the salt intrusion is most stuck in the Mekong Delta because it is where the river empties into the sea. And I think apart from the issue of sediment loss, the issue of salt intrusion and sea level elevation have been very critical and serious for Vietnam. I think in the medium term, if not already felt very acutely in certain parts of the Mekong Delta.
Thank you. So Anurag and then Hongtu, is there anything brief you would like to add on the last question?
Yeah, I mean, it's well known that the Mekong, undergoes a lot of challenges. It's not a natural river anymore, but also that's not all bad, right? If you look at everywhere in the world, things have developed, and you can capitalize on positive development, or you can, take opportunities or take advantage of bad development, right? So there's a lot of hardworking people and institutions in the Mekong that would like to see more positive development, right? That we don't want to see, say, for example, the Mekong turning into the blue Danube, for example, right? And we don't want to see, people being displaced. People have no ideas when the water flows will be released or restricted, right? And we don't want to see, fish being lost further, for example. But just bear in mind that development in the Mekong is not only related to the water sector. There's an exogenous development as well, right? So there's roads, there's urbanization, there's population growth, and all of these add to the consequences of development. So how to get the balance right? This is the perennial human question, right? We have to just try our best. The things that I outlined maybe are some of the ingredients to make things more transparent, to make things more consultative, to make things more scientific, less perceptions and feelings, right? Because a lot of things we hear in the media are perceptions and feelings, right? So we just have to come together and work together. But the journey will not end. In 100 years, the Mekong will change. Maybe the Mekong will be the Danube in 100 years, where you have, nice recreation on different stretches of Danube. You have many dams, and all the concerns are only about water quality, right, in the Danube. But now the concerns about other kinds of impacts. Or it can turn into, the Murray-Darling, where there's a lot of drought, right? And farmers are fighting about water. In the Mekong, we don't fight about water. We just fight about impacts, right? But with climate change, in 100 years' time, now the models, they say different things, right? In 100 years, 50 years, some models say that there will be severe droughts. Some models say there will be severe floods, right? So how do we prepare for that, right? And a lot of work now are going on about, say, to get the modeling right, but also to put in place mechanism to coordinate all the infrastructure. So then if you have severe drought, then you have to make the dams release the water. And if you have floods, then you have to make the dams hold back and sacrifice maybe energy and other use, right? So that's how we have to do. It's not a perfect answer, it's not a perfect world, but I think everybody has a stake in these large rivers, not only for the riparians, but also for the region and for the world, because the Mekong is so important as a great river of the world.
Thank you, Anurag. Hongtu, would you like to add any final remarks on this?
I don't have anything to add, just echo what Anurag said, right? The key is to balance, right? Balance short-term costs in terms of dam development and long-term benefit that can bring. And those who suffers, and those who benefit, and also environmental social costs with potential economic ones. Different sectors may experience different impacts. So how to strike a balance, that's $1 million question or $1 billion question. It's not that easy.
Thank you very much. That was a very thought-provoking 90 minutes. So first of all, I would like to thank the panel for their time. It is very much appreciated that you join us up, for this session. And I would also like to thank our audience for coming over and being engaged with your questions. I wish everyone a great evening. Thank you.